gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha. You betcha. She bounced last and she's coming out swinging. She bounced last and she's just about taking all that she can take. And it's payback time, motherfuckers, it's payback time. I said it's payback time, motherfuckers, it's payback time.
Welcome to Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network. It's NBL on PRN.FM. This May 5th, 2020, Cinco de Mayo edition, episode 138 of Nature Bats Last, comes to you live from Rakino Island in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from Central Florida in the United States. This is Kevin Hester, and I'm joined by my co-host, Professor Guy McPherson. In addition, today we have a special guest. Guy, will you do the honors, please?
Thank you, Kevin. Today we are delighted to have Kirkpatrick Sale on the show. Sale is a prolific author who has written about political decentralism, environmental issues, Luddism, and technology. He founded the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, an American graduate school within Middlebury College, a private college in Middlebury, Vermont. Sale's passion for uncovering and revealing evidence was demonstrated while he was associate editor and then editor-in-chief of the student-owned and student-managed newspaper at Cornell University, the Cornell Daily Sun. While an undergraduate at Cornell, Sale was one of the leaders of a protest against university policies forbidding fraternizing between male and female students. In the early 1980s, he taught at Goddard College in Vermont and presented programming for New York City's progressive radio station, WBAI. However, he is best known as an author of more than a dozen books, the latest of which is The Collapse of 2020, published in January of this year. He is also the author of many, many articles. Among his latest writing is an essay published at Counterpunch on September 26th of last year. I greatly enjoyed this recent essay titled The Illusion of Saving the World. Kirkpatrick, welcome to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I should clear up some of the mistakes of that introduction. I never had the pleasure of being nestled in Middlebury College. I did start the Middlebury Institute, which had nothing to do with Middlebury College. It took its name from the town, but not the college. And unlike certain people famous in the current make yourself feel good environmental movement, I was never attached to Middlebury College, and never have been attached to any college or university, which says something. I have never wanted to be, and they have never wanted me. One time, when a junior faculty member at a distinguished New Jersey university said, "You would be perfect to come next year. Be the writer in residence here next year, New Jersey. You'll get the job." Last I ever heard from him. They don't want me. The academy doesn't want me. It's all right. It's all right. I grew up in the academy. My father was a professor. I knew all about Cornell University, which is why when I went there as a student, I was able to talk about it and demonstrate against it. But no, I've never had anything to do with any university. which is why I go on writing books and trying to teach that way. Only way left to me.
Well, this is Guy, and I made that mistake.
I am happy, Kevin, to be here.
Patrick.
Yes.
So, sorry for making that statement. This is Guy.
I'm delighted to be on this program, although we have to acknowledge that Guy has been doing this sort of thing for a great many years, and I am joining the caravan only in the last 4 or 5 years.
If you're listening live, this is for our listeners. Please call in with questions or comments for us and for our guest. Our toll-free number is 888-874-4888. And that number is included at the bottom of my latest post at the Naturopath's last blog, GuyMcPherson.com. Kirkpatrick, your latest book, The Collapse of 2020, follows a bet you made quite some time ago involving the collapse of the industrial economy. Will you fill us in on the details?
Well, yes. It was in 1995. I had written a book called Rebels Against the Future about the Luddites in the 19th century England, favorably about the Luddites and favorably about the neo-Luddites that I identified in the 20th century that were, again, bringing up questions about technology and the dangers of technology. And I'd hoped to get people stirred up talking about technology just as it was beginning, this is 1995, just as it was beginning to just pour over them in waves, torrential waves that they could not begin to resist, even though I tried to resist it. And a guy from Silicon Valley who worked for Wired magazine, which is the Bible for the technophiles of Silicon Valley, he came to interview me in New York, and it was a kind of a hostile interview, and he was all for technology, and I pointed out the dangers. And suddenly, at one point, he said, all right, you think that the world is going to be bad if this technology overtakes. He said, what do you think is going to happen? And I laid it out. I said, ecological damage, and that ecological damage is likely to spark political and economic damage as well. I foresee the time coming in a new world when the dollar will not any longer be a usable currency. I see economic chaos. I see times in the future when the political systems won't hold, and that there will be wars and internal rebellions all over the world. And he said, oh, yeah? He said, when's that going to happen? And I had not, I confess, given a single thought to when that was going to happen. But here we were in 1995, so I thought way away in the future. I said, 2020. It had a nice ring to it, 2020. And he said, all right. And he got out $1,000 check. He slapped it on my desk, and he said, I'll bet you $1,000 that it doesn't happen in 2020. What could I do? So I got out a checkbook. I figured by 2020 the dollar wasn't going to be worth anything anyway, so I said, all right, here's my $1,000. And he wrote up this interview in Wired magazine called Interview with a Luddite, and he reproduced the two checks and told of this bet, and it was splashed all over his magazine and then on the Internet. The Internet just then beginning to splash in our lives, and it became a rather famous bet on a betting site on the Internet. And so we go on, and suddenly 2020 began to come near. And so I said, I'll write a book on saying how close did we come to the collapse. And I started that 2 years ago. And a year ago, Kevin Kelly from Wired magazine, he emails me and say, well, how about that bet? It's going to come due. I said, well, we'll see. I figure if it's 2020, I have until December 31st. He said, no, you shouldn't have that. I said, that's what I insist upon, December 31st. And then I wrote the book, which came out in January of this year. And it said the collapse of 2020. And it laid out what was sick and decayed about the systems that we now have around us, political, environmental, and economic. And when I was done, I was astonished to see I had taken but 50 pages to make this case against the world as it is in 2020 and why it is collapsing. I had to say at the end of the book, which I wrote in December of last year, the book was published in January of this year, I had to say at the end of the book that the collapse doesn't seem to have come yet, but we have another year to play it out. And even if it hasn't come yet, we are close enough to seeing where and why it is going to collapse, if not this month, then next, and the month after that. And so that's where we are now. And then suddenly there comes a pandemic collapse, a system which I had never begun to consider. That I did consider that there would be new diseases. I knew pretty well that with the melting of the permafrost and that there would be new diseases, but I hadn't anticipated that the viruses in their clever little way would get stronger and more powerful as they have done in the COVID virus. And so we, in addition to the collapses that I had predicted, that we have this collapse, and it shows in glittering detail just what my collapse was about. That is, none of the systems that were supposed to hold in our society held when this pandemic came. The economic system collapsed completely. There are some people with enough money on Wall Street and their friends in the Fed in Washington to pretend to keep Wall Street alive, which they will pretend for some months more, but obviously it can't go on. They don't have those billions. Economic system collapsed. Political systems collapsed everywhere. All international systems collapsed. Most national systems collapsed. And it's a demonstration of the power of environmental systems to wreak their damage upon our society. As they're continuing to do, I think there will be less CO2 in the atmosphere at the end of this year, but not significantly enough to change the amount that we have built up over the past years. So global warming will continue despite this blip. And the virus is an example of how fragile our systems are in the face of a determined element of nature.
Of course. How could there not be? Where do you think we get all those materials that support the industrial economy, the wood and the cement and so on? It of course, comes from the living planet. So you can't have one without the other.
Back with you.
Oh, welcome back. Sorry about that. The pre-collapse loss of our connection with you. Whilst you're off the air, I mentioned in your 2019 Counterpunch article titled "Political Collapse: The Centre Cannot Hold." In it, you mentioned that 65 countries are currently at war and 76 are in various stages of collapse. I want to ask you about that, but I want to give you a little background on me. I lived and worked in Mozambique on a development project in 1991 during the war, and I watched collapse unfold and the process that took place in Mozambique. I worked in Mozambique during the Civil War, where the apartheid launched war against Mozambique, and I watched collapse unfolding. And I see that happening in so many African nations. And a lot of it is to do with the militarism. Can you go into your thoughts on the militarism and what effect that is driving the collapse, please?
Well, the number of wars that I listed is a figure that is true as of January of this year, but because of this pandemic, I'm sure that there are even greater wars breaking out in Africa and some parts of Asia that we don't know about yet, because people will be told by governments what to do, and they don't want to do it, and so they will be resisting. Whether it's the form of a rebellion or an outright war, we still don't know. But you know enough of the experience of war to say that in the case of the collapse of systems around you, that's what people do. They go to war.
Absolutely, and I think there's a very huge war brewing at the moment, and it will be to protect US dollar hegemony. I think the war for the greenback is on the way. The shooting war hasn't started, but there are lots of nations now trading oil in anything other than the greenback, and I think that's a really major issue for the US and its ability to just print money out of fresh air.
Well, I think you're right. The obvious economic collapse hasn't quite caught on. They are still trying to pump up the dream, the illusion that they have this money in Washington, that they can just keep printing it or putting it out on their machines, and that they can do it forever, although there is nothing behind it. Nothing behind it except the good will of the United States, which is diminishing very quickly. Nobody with any sense could believe that there was a sound economic system in the United States to back up this dollar. I think within the next 3 months, this whole Wall Street illusion will blow up in their face. I don't know, is that too soon, do you think?
No, I honestly don't. I think that just before the pandemic was declared, the Fed was pumping trillions and trillions in, and it wasn't working. The velocity of money was not changing. And then very conveniently, the pandemic arrived and everything got shut down. But we're not operating in any kind of normal or realistic paradigm. The whole way the world is working at the moment, where our owners are telling us to stay home and they will pay us our wages. That is fantasy. There's no semblance of capitalism in that. So I think that that's another aspect of why I believe that the collapse is unfolding as we talk.
Well, will it collapse before global warming takes over?
I would say that the two are closely related, that one is underlying the other.
Yes, I agree. But will this economic collapse be evident before the environmental collapse becomes evident? That's the question I was asking.
Yeah, I think for some people, especially people who live in North America and pursue lives of relative privilege, I think that will be the case. I think the economic collapse will be the first hammer that hits a lot of those people. Some of us who are paying attention have already noticed that environmental collapse has precluded the ability to grow food in places like Central America, the Middle East, and Northern Africa, the southern island states in the South Pacific, for example. So we don't have to look far to find examples of ecological collapse driving economic collapse.
Well, and
when that comes to our neighborhood, we'll see.
But with the rise of little nationalisms around the world in the face of the collapse of internationalism, the food systems will also be disrupted in the next coming months, maybe catastrophically.
I couldn't agree more.
Areas
the chairman of Tyson Foods recently said that the supply chain is collapsing right now. And, that's what he's willing to admit. There's no telling what he actually thinks.
But Trump believes that if he gets the government to take over the meat supply, that everybody will be content. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, and I'm pretty sure there are at least a few things that President Trump isn't being fully honest about.
Well, he may not have the mental capacity to absorb everything that other normal people do. I mean, he's a very special kind of guy, and he has a kind of mentality that is excellent for getting certain things done. But it depends upon a limited amount of information and a maximum amount of action. And he's very good at doing that in certain things. But in this case, I don't think he can possibly do it. And then obviously the Democrats can't do it either.
I think he is the perfect candidate to be the last president of the United States of America.
That's very likely. I don't see there being a very good chance of this election taking place in the fall. And with the kind of collapse that I'm predicting and that I talk about in this book, it seems to me quite possibly that there will be reasons that they will give us why there will be no elections. And then after that, I would imagine that the national government would lose its authenticity over time.
In addition to a monetary collapse, a collapse of the monetary system that takes away the confidence of the American people, can you imagine other means by which the collapse could take place within the next few months?
Well, I can imagine. I can imagine political collapse, as I just suggested. That refusal to hold the elections. I cannot at the moment see a greater collapse than a coronavirus as a demonstration of nature's power over our technology.
It's almost as if nature is in charge, not human will.
There could be other viruses also. What we seem to find out is that the virus is a fiercely operative set of systems that has, over the last 20 years, reappeared regularly with ever more viciousness and capacity to spread. There's no reason to think that this is going to be the last one.
Right. In fact, there have been recently discovered several viruses that are coming off of melting glaciers. So you're correct. I don't think there's any reason to expect this to be the last pandemic.
Yes, and Guy has talked about permafrost melting and the dangers that might occur with that. That would seem to me very possible to happen within the next year, over this summer.
Yes, it would certainly surprise me if we didn't have more surprises out there in the form of melting permafrost and in addition to melting glaciers. So I certainly see a strong interaction between what's going on with respect to the environment and how we treat ecosystems and what happens with the industrial economy. Yes,
exactly so. Which the establishment doesn't understand. The connection between the environment and the rest of our world. Nature is a calculation that does not enter into most of the equations that the establishment makes. And that is, of course, why we have the problems that we have. But that is also the reason for the force being exerted now against our technosystems. It's because we don't understand nature, we don't factor it in. But nature not only bats last, but these days it's making up the top of the batting order, too, I would say.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So if you could go back in time to fix the ailments of industrial civilization, where would you go? And what would you do when you got there?
I wrote a book about that. It was called After Eden. And I went back to the Industrial Revolution. I went back to the Roman Empire. I went back to the early empires of Saqqad and Egypt. And I went back farther until the place where humans invented killing animals, hunting. Hunting did not take place for most of the million years and more that we were humans. We didn't hunt. We didn't regard nature as oppositional. We were part of nature. We scavenged along with other animals. But a crisis came at 70,000 years ago. And the crisis was caused by, as I analyze it, by the explosion of a volcano that caused global cooling, global winter, instantly. And it was a crisis for the humans that remained. And the ones in southern Africa decided to take up hunting. They invented hunting, and they used hunting, and they killed enough animals to be able to survive. And that kind of attitude, that kind of success spread throughout southern Africa, and that caused the continuation of the Homo sapiens. But it also meant that there was a wholly new attitude toward nature, that for the first time, nature was the enemy, and animals were the enemy, and we had to go kill animals. And if you have ever killed an animal, you might know that this is, even now, after 70,000 years of it, this is quite a powerful grip on the human heart to have to do something like killing an animal. And they had to do this to survive, and so they built up political and mental systems that enabled them to do this. And I think that's where we began that separation from nature, that opposition to nature that we developed over the following 70,000 years to the place where we are now, which is, in effect, doing our best to kill nature. We won't succeed, but we might do a lot of damage to nature in that process.
Right, and that 70,000 years ago corresponds to the cognitive revolution as described in relatively straightforward language by Yuval Harari in his book Sapiens. And
Yes.
so, as with many of these outcomes, there might be an interaction between what's going on in the species, in the human brain in this case, and what's going on with the environment. So there could be a lot more going on than we understand. I suspect there always is. And yet
a lot more going on in nature or in our psyches?
Both. There's so much we don't know about either one. Especially considering the hubris we demonstrate, which demonstrates even further how little we actually know.
And how little inclined we are to learn from how little we know. Yes.
Yes.
On that subject, I'd like to bring up something that I heard you say, Kirk, where in one of the interviews that you did, you denounced scientists for peddling hopium. And I think this is a really important subject where there's so much self-censorship from the tenured science faculty community. What are your thoughts on the understatement of the severity of the crisis from the general scientific community?
Well, I can tell you this. In 1980, I wrote a book called Human Scale. And 3 years ago, a publisher asked me to revise it. And so I wrote Human Scale Revisited after 37 years. And what I did was take out all the hope that I had put into it in 1980. Even in 1980, I was not exactly convinced about all of this hope, but the publisher told me that if you're going to publish a big book, you have to have hope in it. And so I put hope in it. But in the revision, I took all of the hope out. And then when I began to learn who the near-term human extinction people were and their talk about hopium, I understood exactly what we were up against and why I was glad that I had taken out hope from my book. And of course, in the collapse of 2020, I end it without any hope. And I say, in fact, at the end of it, I say hope was the one thing left in Pandora's box, but we never took it out, and we never should take it out. It's there in the box for a good reason, because there is no hope.
Wow. There's an interesting or a good quote from Chris Hedges from his documentary American Psychosis. Quote, "If hope becomes something you express through illusion, then it's not hope, it's fantasy."
So, in the meantime, Kirkpatrick, we haven't collapsed yet. So, the system is still apparently serving at our pleasure. So, do you have recommendations for people? If the collapse is complete within the next 3 months or the next 8 months or whatever, the next year, do you have recommendations for people and how they live?
Well, of course, there is some real question as to whether humans are going to live very much longer. And since that's an open question, my only feeling is that we should attend to our own selves and our own families and, if possible, our own communities, and try to live outside of the effect of all of these systems as much as we can. And if the total collapse comes along with diseases or temperatures that will kill human beings, there's nothing much we can do about it. We can just gather our grandchildren unto our bosoms and say we made a mistake. But what I am going to do, in fact, is I'm leaving my home here in South Carolina, and I'm going back to Ithaca, New York, where I was born, and going back near my daughters, who are not too far away, and with my son-in-law, who's there. And I want to live on a self-sufficient farm. And as things collapse around and the depression gets worse than anything we've ever been taught, then I want to be able to have my own food from my own farm for as long as I can. That's the best I can imagine for my career, a hunkering down in my hometown around food and family.
That's great, and you foresaw the next question I was going to ask, which was, how do you live in light of this information? And it sounds like you're taking action-oriented steps to be close to the ones you love and also to provide for your own food supply.
There was a man in England, a Welshman in England, when I was there in the 1980s, who wrote a book on self-sufficiency. John Seymour was his name. His books were published, and I think that they may still be published. But he was teaching us self-sufficiency back then, and a lot of communards were listening to him back then. But self-sufficiency, I think, is what we have to depend upon for as long as we can, and that's what I will try to be doing. Of course, we have become so attuned to a system in which almost nothing is self-sufficient. So I don't know how well I will be able to adapt to this, but at least that is the goal, self-sufficiency.
And it sounds as if you will have some help along the way in the form of family members.
That depends. It may happen by force, or it may happen by choice. I don't know.
Are you familiar with the aerosol masking effect, which is sometimes called global dimming?
Yes. In fact, I have a friend who is a great proponent of that. And I mentioned him in my book in passing.
Oh, okay. That's great. So I want to turn this a little bit personal. What would you consider to be your most important contribution so far? For me, it's always the last thing I wrote, but I'm not sure that applies to all writers.
I don't know. I would say that book that I mentioned about locating our problems 70,000 years ago was an important book, and I think the Human Scale book is a book that will forever teach people at which scale on the earth, with respect to the earth, we should be living, if in fact we continue to be living. I have that fond hope that if anything, if books survive, that they will be the only things that can teach people in the future not to do what we have done. And so on my gravestone I have written the word writer, and I have to believe that what I have written is the only way that wisdom in the future, I mean, what I have written and others, is the only way that wisdom will be available for future generations, if there are any. But who knows?
Right. So assuming industrial civilization persists for longer than both of us believe, say into next year, and everything seems to be going swimmingly, will you continue to write? Do you have specific projects that you're working on now with respect to your writing?
Oddly enough, just recently I have conjured up a project which I might go into in the evenings when I've brought in the hay, and it has to do with going back to Ithaca. Odysseus went back to Ithaca, and this guy Homer wrote a big whole long thing about it. And so I was thinking of looking at my career compared to Odysseus' career, and although I haven't fought any Trojan Wars, I have met Circes who have turned all of my allies into animals. I have met various forces and dangerous thinkers and unwilling people in my years. I've tried to teach them what's wrong with nuclear power, what's wrong with Vietnam War, what's wrong with wars, what's wrong with our attitude to nature, what's wrong with this and that. I've tried to teach that, and the forces have been arrayed against me, powerful forces, because I want to change the world, the techno world that we live in. And this was the same kind of difficulties that Odysseus faced as he tried to go back to Ithaca. So I thought maybe I would be a little bit of a Homer and try to write about my career and coming home to Ithaca.
That's great. It sounds to me that you have been influenced by Daniel Quinn. Do you know him by chance?
I do not know the man. I do know his various works.
Okay.
No,
and
I haven't really, but I can see what you mean. I thought his was a rather cheap way of telling that story, but that may be wrong on my part.
Well, he went on to try it in other ways besides fiction. He tried a non-fictional account, an attempt to get out a similar message in any event. So who have been your primary influences as you have pursued a life of writing?
Oh, God. Well, Lewis Mumford, I would say, comes up highly. Lewis Mumford, Leopold Kohr, E.F. Schumacher. In political terms, Murray Rothbard and Murray Bookchin. Very disparate people, those two Murrays, but very influential in me. That's about it.
What about Joseph Tainter?
No, but I of course read what he had to say. He's an academic, and I distrust academics. You'll notice that the people I have just suggested were important to me. All of them worked outside of the academy. I don't trust academics.
Touche, well said. Hey, I've been impressed with your certainty that collapse is either imminent or unfolding, because that's how we feel as well. What are your thoughts on the cognitive dissonance surrounding the denial of how precarious our position is?
what to make of it.
What to make of it?
More of the same that we've dealt with all these years. No matter our cause, we live in a world of denial.
You mean that's not just a river in Egypt?
Well, it caused a lot of trouble back then when it was just a river, and it's causing a lot of trouble now.
Yes, indeed. Oh, by the way, when you guys were saying academics were untrustworthy, I could hear you. Just to be clear. although I did walk away from that life a little more than 11 years ago.
There may be some hope for you, some redemption. Anyway. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope we have some listeners. I spent 10 years talking on WBAI, and hoping every year that I had more and more listeners without knowing if I did. But I hope we have here and now listeners that will understand exactly what we've been trying to say, and we'll be able to face the future better, knowing what we have told them. So, my thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Mr. Sale. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today, and I also very much appreciate your efforts beginning as an undergraduate student and through your 10 years at WBAI and continuing with your recent writing. Thank you very much for your life of service.
Okay.
It seems our guest has left us.
It's been a pretty sketchy connection, but that's what happens as you teeter at the brink of collapse. Hey, I'd like to thank our listeners and callers today. You can catch NBL on PRN the first Tuesday of every month at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The next it will be broadcast on the 2nd of June, the next episode. It's PRN.FM, the Podbeam, or at Stitcher, and feel free to rate us on iTunes. Also, continue to follow the Nature Bats last blog, GuyMcPherson.com, for further updates, interviews and speaking tours, and you can keep current with my work at KevinEaston.live. Thanks again to today's guest, Kirkpatrick Sale, our listeners, and also to Afrozine for his music. Guy?
Until next time, remember the dominant culture has been very clever, but in the end, nature bats last.
Over to you, studio.
Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you.